Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's session, focused specifically on PAM, or Privileged Access Management. Today, we'll cover why we feel this should be front of mind for many of you that focus on security solutions for your organization. I'd like to introduce today's panel. My name is Paul Watson. I'm Peak CTO. I'm joined today by Matt Mannis. Matt's Peak's Director of Security, Jean Ballard, who will be walking us through some of the technology aspects of today's presentation. Jean is the security architect for Peak. And finally, Ryan Ruggles, who's from IBM, who's a security segment leader focused on identity-based solutions. So today's agenda, today we'll be covering 5 critical concerns like who has access to what, risk mitigation strategies, remote users, and much, much more. Today, where we find ourselves is privileges are built into applications, OSs, file systems, databases, hypervisors, management platforms, DevOps tools, you name it, it's there. And cyber criminals will typically covet privileges or privileged access because it can expedite their access into a organization's most sensitive data and, of course, highlight targets. With privileged credentials and access in their clutches, a cyber attacker can then seed a piece of malware, and then they basically become an insider with full access to the most important information that your company holds, namely data. I'll be back at the end of the session with some closing remarks. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Matt, who's going to kick us off with who has access to what and really why. So with that, Matt, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Paul. So I'm going to take us through privileged users and why they have access, or they do have access to your most critical data, and why that can be troublesome. So I'm old enough to remember when this area was called PIM, Privileged Identity Management, and now it's, I guess, the more widely known term is PAM, Privileged Access Management. So it can be confusing just even naming the space, right? The Gartner Magic Quadrant calls it PAM, Forrester Wave still calls it PIM. So we're going to try and demystify some of maybe the jargon around privileged access management, as well as what it really means to your organization. So who has access to what across disparate environments? As Paul mentioned, there are a lot of different environments making this more complex than it used to be, right? A lot of my customers are adopting cloud, even if they are just a little bit. So we have hybrid environments, various different environments that you're going to have privileged credentials for. Paul kind of listed all those off, but it makes it a difficult task. And unfortunately, up to 80% of all security breaches involve the compromise of privileged accounts. Now, that typically happens through the attack chain, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the slide here. But what happens is, in that stage where an attacker elevates privileges, then they're able to have the privileged accounts, and they're able to access, again, the keys to the kingdom, the map to the crown jewels, yada, yada, whatever you want to call it, because they have those elevated privileges. And also, unfortunately, more than 20% of organizations fail to change their default passwords. So let me give you a good example of how that can be exploited from the OT world. So I can use something called Shodan, which you can find out on the internet if you want to look up what's connected to the internet. And basically, I can find what industrial control systems are connected to the internet. And then I can find out who the manufacturer of that system is, go ahead and look up the manual online, and I can find out what the default admin password is, the default password, as well as the username. And just like that, I have remote access to an industrial control system, which can cause a lot of havoc. And that's just one example, and a way that the bad guys might go ahead and try and infiltrate your systems since your passwords weren't changed. But it's, like I said before, it's become a very difficult task to maintain visibility across all these disparate environments. And we're going to talk later on about how we solve some of these issues. But it is a problem that many organizations are facing today. So why don't we talk about the attack scenario real briefly, and we'll kind of uncover some of the things that typically happen. So number one is establish a foothold. And we did talk about this in one of our previous virtual roundtables where we discussed the whole attack chain in more detail. But establish a foothold, whether it be through malware, via phishing campaign. We're trying to get onto that endpoint if we're the bad guys. And when we do, we can throw a keystroke logger down there, get your username and password to various accounts across whatever you have access to. And then the tricky part where we elevate the privileges, and then we have access as a privileged user, and we can move through the network undetected. And finally complete our end goal, which a good example of that is, let's say this whole scenario went through a ransomware attack, right? With those elevated privileges, the attacker is able to access the keys to the kingdom and the map to the crown jewels and get to those crown jewels, which is typically your customer data. And, our organizations have gotten very good at actually restoring for backup in a ransomware type of attack. But unfortunately, the attacks always change. And so in a response to how good we're getting at restoring from backup, now ransomware attacks are taking the method of, you pay the ransom or I release all this data. So, it's constant back and forth, cat and mouse type battle to try and get ahead of the curve. Privileged access management allows us to make sure that second stage where privileges are elevated is taken care of, because through the solutions that are available today, you're able to do lots of things. You're able to record sessions. You're able to track who has access to what. You're able to issue credentials on a limited basis, as Ryan will talk about more. You're able to cycle through some of those passwords. So we do have a solution here for these problems, but what we're doing here in the beginning is kind of showing you what the problems are. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Ryan now, while Paul goes and changes his password to his luggage.
Hey, thanks, Matt. So as Paul mentioned, my name is Ryan Ruggles, and I am the North America Channel's segment leader for IBM Security, specifically covering the digital trust portfolio, which encompasses the Guardium data security product, as well as all of our identity and access management products. So I'm really excited to be here and go over some of the different insider threats and cover a couple different concerns. So as we learned from Matt, the privileged accounts, they have the capacity to become an absolute catastrophe when it comes to your hypersensitive data, even more so when these accounts are not properly managed and monitored. So I want to dive in a bit more and talk about potential insider threats and how your organization is not just at risk from the outside threats, but also from inside threats, whether they're malicious or just your typical inevitable user error. So let's begin by discussing the perpetually evolving landscape and a few of the critical concerns that churn up as a direct result. So as we all know, the influx of remote workers has dramatically altered the way organizations view their PAM accounts, especially in remote locations. But I definitely do not want to let this messaging confuse you into believing that only remote accounts are at risk. On-prem accounts are just as at risk for any type of attack. So that said, the complexity of maintaining and monitoring these priority accounts is critical to an enterprise's operations running smoothly. So Matt touched on the need to cycle your privileged account passwords on a regular basis, but I feel it's worth repeating again. So an example is one of the most sobering statistics I've heard in recent memory with my time at IBM is that there are still oodles of enterprises who still use spreadsheets or Post-it notes to keep track of their PAM accounts and passwords. When I heard that, that blew my mind, and immediately my brain was just like, well, companies that are still using an analog method to keep these accounts in check should seriously consider modernizing their privileged accounts and management system they use, especially for a new remote and digital age. So these privileged account users, I'm going to call them the super users, who have access to the privileged enterprise materials are still at risk for downloading applications and programs that they may not knowingly realize are detrimental to the enterprise's data and overall existence. I'm confident you're all aware that all it takes is one click to create a series of serious issues. So actually, a personal example that came up just this week on Monday, I myself received a link that was more than likely malicious, but the email subject's actually what caught my eye, and it was titled HR compliancy issue, urgent, in all caps with 2 exclamation points. So I remember being on a conference call and being like, well, that's weird. So I clicked on the email, and there was an attachment. And, you know, me being the upright corporate citizen I am, I was honestly concerned that I was in trouble or that I had caused issues within the organization. So when I went into the body of the email, the body of the emails went on to say, like, please open the attached document immediately to review your HR compliancy issues immediately. So it said immediately twice, and I was like, that's weird. So when I went into it and investigated a little bit further, I didn't click on the attachment, thank goodness, because it looked like it was a link to a website. When I noticed that the sender email address was extremely funky and barely recognizable, that's when I subsequently deleted and reported the email. That's just an example. It's like if I was a privileged account user and I had seen that email and I did click that attachment, that could have caused a lot of problems. And the reason I gave this example is to show that anyone is at risk of creating an insider threat, even if they don't have malicious intent. Maybe they're just trying to do what they feel is right within the company. So now that we're mostly all free-range remote workers, a singular view on these privileged accounts has become far more difficult to hone in on and monitor efficiently and effectively. So that's going to bring us to the need to increase oversight of remote employees and third parties with access to your organization's critical and privileged data. Okay, alert fatigue is a real issue these days, whether it's the pings, the dings, the little red bubbles that remind you that you haven't reached back out to somebody or you owe somebody. That's pretty much our day for just about all users nowadays. So that's why it's ultra important to understand and know the signs of these potential insider threats. So when suspicious activity is discovered, you would want to be alerted to the problem and the potential fixes. But what happens in between the known issues is key to maintaining a healthy PAM ecosystem. So as Matt mentioned before, like rotating old and often overused passwords, requiring additional approvals based on bizarre login and uniquely suspicious keystroke data. A couple other pieces like the ability to monitor and record these PAM accounts and sessions every step of the way can prevent and mitigate many issues before they even begin. As they say, what's that old saying, an ounce of PAM maintenance is worth 10 times its weight in related IT migraines and lost nights of sleep due to sensitive data making its way into the wrong hands. I think that's how that saying goes. But trusted users, they can be utilized by outside sources to gain access to this information at any time. So being prepared is key to staying above the fray.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to add a little something there about insiders. So, you know, while most of the attacks, you know, up here are probably coming from the outside and very little from the inside, when you look at the successful attacks, the ones that are the most successful are the insider attacks. So, you know, we want to trust our employees, obviously, but it's more trust and verify. So therefore, we need to know what they're doing when they have this privileged access, because it's really something that they can do a lot of damage with. So just ask Snowden about that.
Yeah, he knows. So thank you, Matt. That's a good point. So then while, I mean, we know remote users are increasingly at risk, but I think it's important that we should expand the complexities to also include some of our favorite buzzwords, which is endpoints and cloud. Perfect. So whether the user resides remotely or within the walls of the organization, I think we can all agree that their ability to not only access privileged data is important, but ensuring that the right people are accessing the right information at the right place and time, that can absolutely be a bear of a burden for any organization. So many organizations are lifting and shifting applications and files to the cloud platform of their choice, which may present another fun set of critical concerns for the IT arm of an enterprise. So I think it's pretty important to dive into a few of those concerns that may bubble up as a result of this hybrid environment. So imagine your cloud access is like a super exclusive restaurant that everyone is just dying to get into. You have your bouncer at the front door who resembles a 1950s refrigerator, except a little bit colder on the shoulder. He has a velvet rope. He's standing in front of the door with a sign labeled "Privilege Users Only." So they have a clipboard in hand as well that automatically identifies the user, shows which menu items and rooms they have access to within the restaurant, since they are privileged rewards members. I bet as a restaurant owner, you'd feel much better knowing that that tank of a bouncer is ensuring people who are supposed to get access do, and that they're monitored throughout their time within the restaurant. So a great PAM solution would allow a secure connection with checkpoints along the way to ensure additional protection, such as multi-factor authentication, adaptive access, single sign-on, a couple different things. The overall goal of a PAM solution should be secure access to the folks who need it, and to add additional layers of protection to ensure that these privileged accounts remain secret and safe. So one group we should touch on is the administrators. These are the folks who need access in new locations at the time that they need it. So every administrator within an organization has a need to connect to privileged accounts regardless of their location. So accessibility and security are key to administrators maintaining these privileged accounts. Some ways to ease the burden, for example, are having a centralized vault for critical data, such as databases, application root accounts, and oh my, so much more. Being able to monitor administrators' activities from start to finish will provide much needed oversight on who is accessing what info for how long and from where. So similarly to how most parents set time limits for TV or video games, you can set time limits for temporary access to these accounts when necessary. So a single pane of glass to view the overall landscape and shifting environment will not only make these tasks simpler, but it will also allow the administrator to save on valuable time. So with that, I'd like to pass the verbal baton over to Gene to dive into the last two critical concerns that organizations face on a daily basis.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Just quickly, I guess, kind of around endpoints, what you're talking about, you know, with the kind of proliferation of remote workforce that we're currently experiencing, along with wanting to protect privileged access to, you know, systems, critical systems and data on-prem, in hybrid, right in the cloud, there's this dilemma we find ourselves in kind of on the endpoint. So a lot of companies are sort of shifting to, you know, a BYOD strategy where they're no longer managing the endpoint, and it presents a challenge for IT. So a lot of times what we're seeing people do is they're making their users, the day-to-day users on their systems, are local admins. Makes it a lot easier for IT support when they reach out to shadow the user and perform whatever functions they need to under the context of the user. So I think another area that privileged access management critically helps with is maintaining administrative control of those endpoints. There's no reason your users need to run under the context, whether it's managed or BYOD, as an administrator, and still provide that kind of secure access and control back to those endpoints. So yeah, great stuff on endpoints there. Let's talk a little bit about service accounts. So we talked about the importance and challenges around privileged access for traditional identity-based user accounts tied to a person, to critical systems, networks, and applications, as well as cloud and endpoint resources. However, service accounts are yet another kind of often forgotten type of account that has usually very high elevated or privileged access that is critically important when we discuss privileged access management. So service accounts, really, if you think about it, they're non-human privileged accounts. They're used by the operating systems to interact with applications and services on the system and other applications and services on the network. And these accounts are often automatically execute processes under either administrative or elevated privileges to perform various actions that are necessary to the function of the application or service. you know, some of the examples of these things might be like provide access to a database or run scheduled maintenance, replication, batch jobs or scripts, or to provide access to other applications, services, and systems on the network. You know, some of the examples you're probably familiar with would be like, you know, Microsoft SQL Server service account, or the MSDTC, the Distributed Transaction Coordinator account in a SQL cluster. Depending on the application or service being installed, service accounts can utilize built-in system accounts with the highest level of privileges. These are built into your operating system, or locally or manually created user accounts. And manually created user accounts, local to the system, manually created user accounts are usually either local to the system, or often they're directory or domain-based kind of global user types of accounts. And every application or service vendor has their specific requirements or recommendations on which type of account you should use and why. Sometimes it's around convenience. Sometimes it's around requirements for their specific application or service. The problem is those accounts are often lazily given too much permission. This is often just to ease installation or ensure everything works correctly, they'll tell you, rather than explicitly granting least privilege or minimal privilege to do only what is needed. I got to tell you, in all my years, both as a systems engineer and a security engineer, I can't tell you how many countless vendors I've worked with and consultants too that I've worked with where this was a dilemma. You know, oftentimes it ended up being absolutely necessary due to how the application or service was designed or developed, i.e. a poor design. Occasionally I was able to sort of push back or lab it up and figure out how to do a better least of privilege approach or configuration to make it work. But it's an issue that has to be dealt with. And this is why service accounts can be so damaging. The high level of privilege, usually it's over-privileged, over-access that they require. So service accounts in and of themselves are not a bad thing, and are usually traditionally necessary across the environment for your applications and services. However, this is where I think the rub is service account password management. Oftentimes a single account's created and it's used in multiple places, right? I think of creating a domain account for service account for SQL Server that's used to run all the SQL Server service accounts on each of your SQL servers, standalone servers. And granted, sometimes this is a requirement for specific deployments, like in a cluster scenario where you have a SQL cluster and you've got to have a domain account that runs for your distributed transaction coordinator that's used on all the members across the cluster. The problem is these service accounts have been in use for a long time often in the environment. And they're running services and applications day to day. You haven't done any new deployments in a long time or used the account in a long time. And at that point, really, it's difficult for administrators to remember where all the specific service accounts being used. And that makes it difficult to safely change passwords. You risk creating an outage to applications and services. So what's usually the administrator's answer? It's to set the passwords for the service accounts so they never expire. And the rule is we just forget about them and we never change those passwords. Additionally, I think one of the issues is since secure password vaults are often not in use in these scenarios, administrators often set the passwords for these highly privileged service accounts really short, as short as they can without tipping the password policy, and they make them easy to remember in hopes of not forgetting. And God help you if you're following administrative best practices or trying to ease the pain of administration, and you decide you're going to create individual service accounts everywhere that they need to be used, whether locally or centrally in the domain, to try to combat the challenges of knowing where an account is used. So maybe every SQL server gets its own SQL Server service account or any other service accounts it needs, IIS, whatever's running, in hopes of that you're able to change the passwords regularly. The problem is this leads to, you know, what we call kind of service account sprawl. And by the way, this doesn't result in better service account password management. Administrators still don't have the time to take outages for password changes. So oftentimes it just widens your attack surface due to the wealth of service accounts now in your environment, and passwords still are not getting changed. Additionally, service accounts are often not deleted or disabled, you know, cleaned up when an application service system is decommissioned. And this just further aids or adds to the issue of service account sprawl in your environment. At the end of the day, service accounts pose a risk to the organization, just like other privileged types of accounts, especially when managed traditionally, as we've been talking about above. There are a number of well-known reconnaissance attack vectors that target these highly privileged accounts. And it ends one way, giving bad actors highly privileged access to applications and services. Ultimately, that's what has access to your data, which is what they're really after to begin with. You know, while we don't have time to go into specific details, into detail on specific attacks, you've heard of some of the well-known attacks that use service accounts, right? The ability, once somebody's inside your environment, to do LDAP reconnaissance, right? It's read-only access to the directory by default. Using PowerShell to discover your service accounts without using any sort of privileged access to begin with. And then being able to do things like exploit your Kerberos ticket granting ticket service account, right? For golden tickets, which provide high level of authentication into all kinds of services in the environment, or extracting service account passwords with something we call Kerberosing. Nonetheless, those are just a few that I mentioned and can't go into detail, but there are a number of attacks out there that target service account, these high privileged service account service accounts. So this is why a full-featured, well-enforced privilege access management solution as part of your overall identity access management program is so critical. You kind of have to account for it all. You must allow for the privileged service account access required for applications and services to run, while eliminating the service account creation and management dilemmas, the service account password management dangers, the excessive privilege often required or over-provisioned, the added mess around service account sprawl, and the ultimate real risk to the organization that exists in a compromised scenario, and that's your data. Matt, you have any thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, so looking over this list here, password never changed, password set not to expire. I mean, this is the password management policy of my mother-in-law on her home electronics. So definitely.
Your mother-in-law is a high value target.
she's a very sweet person. I love her to death, but she's definitely not the shining star example of how we want to treat passwords. Often when she forgets her, she gives me a call to ask what it is. So
we need to set a meeting.
Exactly. And just a quick personal shout out here for everybody on the call. Please use a password manager. They're really important. They're really helpful. They help secure yourself and your company. Okay.
Awesome.
Why don't we move on to our last point before our question and answer. So I do want to remind everybody that we will be taking questions after this next slide. So get those fired up in the chat, and Allie is going to be our moderator for that. So compliance, the dirty word that we all have to answer to. It's something that is required, but it also ensures that we're dotting our I's, we're crossing our T's, we're doing things the way we're supposed to be doing them, and we can prove it. So again, we talked about who has access to what. We want to know also what are they doing and can we prove it? Many highly regulated industries are going to require an audit trail. Gene's going to talk a little bit later in this slide about specific compliances and what's needed there. But even if you're not in a highly regulated industry, you still want to understand who has access to what and what they're actually doing from a security perspective. And, from the perspective of making sure somebody hasn't gotten into your network, isn't accessing your critical data. So we also do want to review privilege sessions based on risk. Obviously, the more critical the data that we're interacting with, the higher the risk, the higher the value of that data. And we want to review those. We want to make sure we have controls in place, such as session recording. And as we mentioned earlier with the timed account access, where you're issued the password for a certain amount of time, you have access for a certain amount of time, and then it's revoked. Because, I mean, honestly, the majority of our enterprise does not need privileged access. And those that do, they don't need it every single hour of every single day that they're working. So we want to make sure we're reviewing those sessions and we're deploying the proper controls. And then we get into reporting and visibility. I mean, obviously, if we're going to prove or say we can prove who has access to what and what they're doing, we want to be able to report on that. We want to be able to report on that for our leadership, as well as some of these compliances that are going to require it. And it's a lot easier to report on it when you have something that is actually doing the monitoring and the issuing of the keys than trying to do all this manually. And of course, the visibility, right? We want to understand what's going on in our environments. And that, again, goes across all those disparate environments, whether they be cloud, on-prem, or a combination of both. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Gene again to wrap up this slide, and then we'll roll into the question and answers.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. There's a bunch of non-regulatory and regulatory compliances out there, as well as frameworks. In general, privileged access management is either required or it's a best practice. I listed some of the ones here that are kind of top of mind. We see quite a bit, PCI DSS, obviously NIST 800-53, NIST 800-171, and the new CMMC. You have the worldwide standard ISO 27001, and some of the data protection ones like GDPR and CCPA. Speaking of the data protection ones, GDPR and CCPA don't have specific requirements around PAM, but just in general, while it may not necessarily be well or formally spelled out in any framework or in any compliance, they're key components. PAM's a key component to achieving those compliances, right? Especially these data compliances like GDPR and CCPA. I mean, at the end of the day, after all, with PAM, what we're ultimately protecting is data. So PAM is a big component, even when not specifically spelled out in the compliance world. It's really a way to get your hands around, under that identity access management, your hands around the privileged access management, and really demonstrate and show that you're protecting that data. We run into it oftentimes. We've got customers that say, well, we really don't have a particular pressing compliance that that we've got to deal with each year. So why do I care? And I think we all understand at this point that compliance does not equal security, right? It does not equal being secure. So you want to utilize a mature framework, even if you don't need to have a particular compliance, like a NIST 853 or an ISO 27001. You want to utilize a mature framework when you develop your security program. It's a long play, it's a long roadmap. You kind of bite pieces off each year, but if you develop to a mature framework, you will not only drastically reduce your risk overall in the organization and have a strong security posture, but you'll naturally be compliant when the need arises. And so, I think just kind of to finish it off, I would say that privileged access management streamlines compliance with many regulations at once, right? I have been a part of global organizations that have 20 plus compliances that you have to deal with each year. And so privileged access management is a great way to kind of knock down those compliances while being more secure, right? And improving your security posture overall. And I would say that privileged access management, just like I said, overall improves security. It enables compliance, and it offers that proof and tracing that's critical to the organization. With that, I will turn it over for question and answers.
Thanks, Gene. Just a reminder to everybody on the call, you can send me your questions directly if you'd like to make them anonymous, or you're welcome to put them in the chat for everyone to see. I'll start off with a request. I'm going to put this to Matt, Ryan, and Gene in that order. Matt, you mentioned one of your best practices recommending to use a password manager. Would each of you pick your most important best practice or the point you want to drive home as far as recommendations for those of us on the call?
So from a privileged access management standpoint, or just the password manager?
Just best practices in general on the topic.
So in reality, we're going to talk more about the solution here in our future thought. Typically on these virtual roundtables, we have some discussion in the beginning to kind of set up the issue and the problem that we're facing. And then through the questions and answers, as well as the future thought, we talk about the solutions. So, you know, for me, I think the biggest point here is that we do have solutions for these problems, and they're good solutions. You know, this segment of our industry has been evolving over the last 5 years, especially. And there are some exciting things that that Ryan's going to talk about after the question and answer about how IBM is going to help solve these problems along with peak resources. So forgive us if we belabored the point a little bit on the first half of this, kind of setting up why it's important, but we will talk about how we solve these problems as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to that a little bit of, I guess, distinction. If the question is around favorite password managers, the first thing I would say is where I would use a password manager, right? So I have my favorites. I have my open source KeyPass that I love to use. It's free. It's highly secure, right? LastPass is a great password. These are important things for like in your personal life, managing all your sensitive passwords and keeping things, things locked up. But I think when we're talking about in a corporate or organization environment, I don't think today that password managers are a good solution, obviously, for managing privileged access management, secure passwords for your privileged accounts. That's where a solution like IBM comes into play. And that's what we're working with our customers on to do, is move all your privileged access to a robust solution that can automate some of that and build workflows and do a lot of the things that you need to do to truly protect those privileged access. Is there still a play in the corporate environment for it? Sure. I've got access into systems that's not administrative, that I want to set a unique password and I want to be able to vault it and protect it and encrypt it. There's still a play for password management in the environment. But as far as privileged access is concerned, we want to stay away from the old school method of trying to use password managers and use a robust PAM solution.
Ryan, do you have anything to add?
From my point of view, just the discovery of privileges, establishes a secure vault, protect the passwords, meeting compliance. I mean, just the ability to identify all the service and application and administrators and root accounts, that's a pretty big talking point too. Just ask, where do you know where your privileged accounts reside? No? Oh, okay. Well, we have a product there. We'll help you discover and then protect those passwords, help you meet compliance, and it just kind of builds from there. So, yep. Yeah.
This kind of ties into that. Is there a product or solution that can help automatically rotate or change my service account passwords?
Yeah, Ryan, I'll let you take that. Is there a solution that will help you rotate and manage automatically those sensitive passwords?
Yes, absolutely. So as far, and that's one of the things I'm going to be jumping into a little bit more in the next coming slides, where I go into some of the specifics and the use cases around our IBM Security Verify Privileged product. And yeah, so as far as the automatic rotation of passwords, the product itself, it centralizes, it automates, and it just helps monitor and secure as well. So yeah, and Ali, if you wouldn't mind, when we get out of the Q&A portion, I jump into that. I have a feeling a lot of those questions, like the capability questions, might be answered by that.
Sure.
But yeah, we do have a solution for that.
Perfect. Okay. Next one. I've heard PAM tools are challenging for administrators to manage. Is that true?
Matt, if you want to take that one.
Sure. So, like I said, this segment of our industry has evolved a lot recently, and I came from a time when we originally called it PIM, but in the past, yeah, that was an issue, and these tools have gotten better. And I would say, if you have any question about that and you'd like to see it in action, we're going to talk about the solution here. But if you'd like to see it in action, you'd like to demo it and actually maybe do a proof of concept in your own environment, we can show you how easy it is to manage. And to the point that Ryan made, how easy it is to discover the assets that have privileged privileged accounts tied to them. We can show all that, and we're happy to. So as a follow-up to this meeting, if you want an individual one-on-one meeting with your organization, we're happy to do that, and we'll show you, just how easy it can be.
I mean, I can add from the engineering perspective, just having kind of boots on the ground deployed some of the more legacy or earlier solutions, some of the competing solutions, even still today against the IBM solution that Ryan's going to be presenting. I mean, traditionally what I saw, it was a very arduous, manual, non-automated, non-workflow process that you started trying to bolt things onto, and you'd get about a quarter of the way out of the gate. You really didn't have visibility of what you were trying to integrate. It really didn't have some of the automation and discovery features. And so what ended up happening is you never fully deployed it. And you spent all this money. It partially worked in the environment. And so that's some of what, Peak and IBM together today are able to resolve, is being able to automate and discover, build workflows, make it a very turnkey, easy to deploy solution that really kind of takes it off the plate. You deploy it 100%, you cover yourself 100%, and it's something that's, doesn't need to be, and it buys that time back. We used to have time suck where administrators would sit and play with these tools. And I think if you set it up right and you deploy it fully and you allow it to alert and notify like it's supposed to, it'll be huge. So yeah, we're happy to go into that deeper.
That's a good point. We have time for maybe a couple more. Next one, aren't identity and access management solutions sufficient to protect privileged access?
I don't know. I guess briefly, I would just say there that, when we think about privileged access management, it is a component of your overall identity and access management program, right? So I mean, when you think of IAM, it's really the two together. PAM is a part of IAM. And IAM is really kind of aimed at, providing authentication of identities to ensure that the right user has the right access at the right time. And PAM layers on in a more granular visibility control and auditing over specifically privileged identities and access and activities. So there is a bit of a difference there. And I think people kind of view them as separate, but PAM is really part of your overall healthy identity access management program. And they work hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody have anything to add to that?
One way to describe it, it's like saying hair metal and death metal are the same because they both use guitars. I mean, they both work together. It's just it just strengthens.
They are the same.
Yeah.
I used to have a lot of hair, and as you can see, I don't anymore. But I still play guitar.
At least you kept that.
Yeah, right. Thanks.
You bet.
One more, I think. Can privileged access management solutions interfere with operational efficiency?
So I mentioned this before about the amount of users that have privileged access, and really even the privileged users, how often they need that access. It's not a all day, 7 days a week type of thing. So for your majority of your users, they don't even have privileged access, so they don't need that. It's not going to interfere with what they're doing. But if you do need privileged credentials and privileged access, you don't need it all day long. So with a solution like Ryan is going to talk about shortly here, it is pretty seamless the way these credentials are issued and revoked. So we don't see that as a barrier at all.
I got to tell you, it helps with operational efficiency 1,000%. I can't tell you how many times we would have a vendor or consultant come on site, and we'd get a trouble ticket in, and it would say, please provision user account for this person, give them admin access, period. And then we have to go back and forth and say, well, what are they accessing and on what days and all of that. And then once you get the access in place, you have to rely on the fact that the accounting department or HR department or whoever has the vendor in working on their particular systems is going to let you know that they're actually done. I can't tell you how many times we either preemptively disabled the access and gotten our hands slapped, or left it open and never heard back and nobody followed up, and that account was sitting out there with access into the system. So I say it improves operational efficiency 1,000%.
Perfect. Okay, any last words before we move on? All right, if there are any other questions, feel free to still drop them in the chat and we're happy to reach out with you after the session's over. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks for the questions, everybody. So now that we've discussed the 5 primary concerns that organizations face regarding PAM solutions, I want to dive a little further into what products IBM Security has to offer to help you along your PAM journey. So when Frodo was given the One Ring by Gandalf at Bag End, Gandalf left Frodo with a key piece of advice: keep it secret, keep it safe. So, and yeah, just a side note, I'd be doing myself a personal disservice if I didn't at least make one Lord of the Rings quote in a presentation, so I can check that box now. So that's good. But imagine, for example, being able to centralize, automate, secure, and allow access to users across your enterprise, regardless of location, in one solution. So many of the concerns we spoke to in the prior slides are immediately addressed by the IBM Security Privileged product. So right out of the gate, it will allow that automated password creation and rotation, which means that the remote users, well, I'd like to think they're less likely to reuse and share passwords, but at least it gives you that level of control so that you can change as needed. So as far as the different pieces that we have available with the product, the least privileged policies, I'm going to dive into that a little bit more, and the session management and the central vault. So yeah, so let's jump into the shallow end of the pool first and discuss some of the use cases that help IBM Security Privilege stand apart from the competition, and how the product can simplify the perpetually increasing risks that you may face on a daily basis. So the 3 use cases to address with Verified Privilege reside in your ability to not only discover, but manage privileged accounts across the enterprise from one location. So imagine having the ability to discover and classify accounts while easily vaulting passwords and securing the passwords for these accounts, while proactively monitoring sessions and keystrokes to better manage and remediate threats, both inside and outside of the organization. So that is precisely what Verified Privilege offers. And I'm thinking now we can put on our floaties and swim a little bit deeper into the deep end and discuss Verified Privilege Vault and Privilege Manager, and what the products are designed to do, with the goal of making your lives easier and maybe just a little bit less hectic. So repetition is the key to learning. Pretty sure I'm confident I've heard that from a TED Talk, so I'm assuming it's true. But as a result, I do not feel silly repeating that Verified Privilege provides a seamless ability to discover those privileged accounts, securely vault and encrypt login credentials to those accounts, as well as secure and manage critical data by automatically rotating passwords and access verification. So monitoring privileged accounts to ensure that the right folks are gaining access where and when they need it. So whether your infrastructure resides on-prem, in the cloud, or a healthy mix of both, Verified Privilege has a fit for your organization. So the product is available on-prem and SaaS, so you have the best options to suit whatever your organizational needs are. Another product to mention is the IBM Security Privilege Manager. So we're going to dive into that one in just a second. But I am really excited to share some news that was just announced yesterday around our privileged account management solution. And that's that IBM Security Verified Privilege will now include our Forrester report winning adaptive access and multi-factor authentication, as well as single sign-on for free. So we spoke earlier to a strong offering utilizing that multi-factor authentication and the need for allowing access to the right people at the right time. You could secure employees' access to the privileged account management solution with that multi-factor authentication. So that's another layer. So with the addition of the MFA, the customers can require multi-factor authentication in order to gain access to their applications. And then with the single sign-on piece, that's going to, I mean, a lot of us know what single sign is as of now, but customers, it allows customers to sign into applications with a single set of login credentials. And it includes federated SSO for cloud applications, employee launchpad, application delegation, conditional access, and a whole host of other pieces. Now I'd like to dive a little bit further into adaptive access. And this slide actually has been making its rounds in a lot of the presentations that I've been working with. But as mentioned, adaptive access is the industry-leading risk-based authentication product available from IBM Security. So don't just take my word for it. If you look at the Q2 Forrester report for risk-based access and authentication, you'll firmly see us place in the upper right-hand leader quadrant, pushing to the edge of having the strongest strategy. So what is adaptive access at a high level? Now, adaptive access essentially learns your users' regular behaviors to verify and be able to seek out or point out irregular behaviors. So, for example, if we were to touch back to, well, we'll use the example here with our friends, the real Francine, and the, well, what I'm going to call her is the fake Francine. So let's say, for example, that Francine on the left, as you see, has green check marks in all of those boxes, meaning Francine, she typically signs in from San Francisco. That's the phone number she has. That's her email, name, typing speed, device usage. You get a whole host of different information. So obviously the real Francine has all of the user profile items that help verify the person accessing the apps and data. It's actually Francine. So if we use the known users criteria, which is our B-Stock friend Francine, we can easily start to detect any anomalous behaviors, such as location geography, login geography, as well as, well, for example, if we look at the right, we notice that the thumbprint is different, so the biometrics are off. We look at the country, looks like it's Russia in Moscow, and since Francine just logged in from San Francisco about 40 minutes ago, highly doubtful she's made it all the way over to Moscow so far. Also notice that the geography, the MAC address is different, the mouse is moving way faster, and unless Francine took a really, really expedited course for Mavis Beacon, teaches typing, I doubt that her typing speed would increase that quickly. So with all of these different factors, you can actually shut down the access for fake Francine before it becomes an issue with that privileged account. So just giving you an extra set of tools that offer that extra level of visibility and protection. And we're going to dive quickly, just for sake of time, dive into the IBM Security Verify Privilege Manager. So what this is going to do, it's going to prevent malware from exploiting local credentials to install on endpoints, which, let's be honest, is arguably the most vulnerable part of your attack surface. So Privilege Manager allows organizations to take a proactive approach to endpoint security and avoid spending time and resources on reactive detection and remediation. You can also easily remove local administrative rights from endpoints and enforce the principle of least privilege. So with that, the last piece I want to touch on for IBM Security Privilege is the manager itself also allows you to create a fast track for those trusted applications while maintaining the least privilege settings. So the ability to reset all endpoints to a clean slate, elevate applications, never users. You can sandbox unknown applications. This is just going to streamline the entire process. And we were talking earlier, it's like time is money. So maintaining the least privilege settings, the Privilege Manager dramatically improves access to apps and systems. And as mentioned, this also has shown to include a bonus benefit of decreasing the amount of IT tickets created due to poor, limited, or lack of access. And time is critical in your organization, especially when privileged data is involved. And we're at the home stretch here. So now that we're out of the metaphorical swimming pool and drying off, let's quickly sum up all the benefits of IBM Security Privilege and IBM Security Privilege Manager. So IBM Security Privilege is a quick to deploy, easy to use and scale solution that also integrates with other IBM security products, such as it includes the Verify Access and those strong MFA capabilities. Capabilities to note, again, are the ability to automate, centralize, and secure access to PAM accounts within your organization, whether remote or on-prem. The ability to integrate with overall IBM security solution stacks, such as QRadar or Guardium or CloudPack. The list goes on. And that's going to allow a robust security solution from front to end. And Verify Privilege is readily available for on-prem, cloud, or the managed service option, the best fit the organizational needs you're looking for. And above all, you got to meet compliance, proactive compliance through auditing, reporting, and alerts. That's a quick way to stay ahead of the regulatory process. So IBM Security, in tandem with our extremely strong relationship with our OEM partner, Iconic, has a complete PAM solution to aid you in your journey to secure and simplify the ever-changing landscape or remote and on-prem users. So living the privileged account management dream does not have to be a nightmare. And I think it goes without saying that all of us at IBM and Peak Resources are here to help you throughout the journey, and look forward to continuing the conversation and give you whatever it is you need to help you move some of these privileged accounts onto a privileged account management solution. We're excited to have you. So thanks again. And with that, I'd like to hand over the verbal baton on over to Paul to close us out. Thanks again.
Thanks, Ryan. Great content. So just to close us out here, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today's brief session on PAM. It's the shotgun approach I appreciate. I hope everybody found the information shared informative and something you could really apply to your specific needs and environment. As a follow-up, we'll be circulating a booklet based on PAM and specifically Psychotic, as Ryan mentioned. You're a recognized industry leader, obviously, with IBM in this particular space. Because we know everybody's different, and no two solutions are the same, we'd welcome the opportunity to connect one-on-one, and discuss your specific needs and how, obviously, this solution could be tailored to your needs. So with that, thank you again. Stay safe. Bye for now.